Imagine this. A boy is running barefoot through the streets of Lahore at 2 in the morning, and nobody is chasing him. He is running towards something. He doesn't know what it is yet. He only knows that if he does not find it before sunrise, he will not be alive to see the morning. His name is Sundar Lal Chopra. He is 15 years old. He comes from one of the most respected Sikh families in the Punjab. His father owns land. His mother was known in 3 villages for her knowledge of the scripture. He has never gone a day without food, without shelter, without the assurance that the world was arranged in his favor, and he is standing on the train tracks outside Lahore with a plan to end everything before dawn. This is where his story begins. Not in the miracle, not in the moment the fire fell. It begins here, in the dark, with a boy who has already decided that life has nothing left to offer him. You need to understand what brought him to those tracks before you can understand what happened next. Because what followed was not the story of a man who had everything going for him and decided to add God to the list. It was the story of a man who had already decided that the list was empty and was interrupted. Comment below with "I am hungry for more" before we go further, and stay with us for the full story. To understand the tracks, you have to go back 3 years to a schoolroom in Rampur, where a British missionary had set up a small classroom for the children of local families. Sundar's father sent him, not out of sympathy for the missionary's work, but because the school was teaching English, and English was practical. Sundar Lal arrived at that classroom the way most 15-year-olds arrive at anything they've been assigned to. Grudgingly, sitting in the back row, arms crossed. But something happened in that room that his father had not anticipated, and that Sundar Lal himself could not explain. Not because of the missionary, not because of the lessons, because of a girl named Priya, who sat 2 rows ahead of him and read from the Christian scriptures aloud with a calm that Sundar Lal had never seen on a human face before. He did not become a Christian. He became curious, and in his family, that was already dangerous. Have you ever noticed how the first thread God pulls is almost always something completely ordinary? A classroom, a voice, 2 rows of wooden benches. The supernatural almost always begins with something so small you would never write it down. Sundar Lal began reading. First, out of competition, he wanted to understand what Priya seemed to understand, wanted to argue with the text the way he had been taught to argue with everything. He was sharp. He was proud of his sharpness. His mother had taught him that a mind that cannot defend itself is a mind that should have stayed silent, but the text did not argue back the way he expected. He had been taught in the Sikh tradition, a tradition he loved, a tradition that had shaped everything he believed about devotion and sacrifice, and the nearness of God. He was not searching for a new God. He was searching for something he could not name, something his sincerity had not produced, something his discipline had not reached. He began reading the Christian Gospels in secret, not to convert, to disprove, and that is when the tragedy arrived. His mother died suddenly of typhoid fever on a Tuesday in October. She was 43 years old. She had been healthy the week before. She was gone in 11 days. Sundar Lal sat at her bedside through the last night and watched the breath leave her, and something left with it, some fundamental assumption about the world being a place where the faithful were protected, where love was enough to hold things together, where the effort of a good life was rewarded with a good life. She was gone, and the certainty went with her. He burned the Bible. He stood in the courtyard of his father's house 3 days after her death and tore the pages out of the Christian scripture and fed them into the cooking fire, one by one, in front of anyone who wanted to watch. He was not having a breakdown. He was making a statement. This book, this foreign intrusion into his family's peace, had done nothing, had promised everything and delivered nothing. He had read it looking for an argument, and instead it had made him soft, and soft was how you lost your mother and felt as though the floor had gone out from under the world. He went back to his tradition. He doubled his prayers. He increased his fasting. He sat with the scriptures he had grown up with and willed them to be enough. They were not enough. This is the part that almost nobody who tells stories about revival converts will say out loud. The hunger that drives someone to a genuine encounter with God is usually not a hunger that good religion has failed to satisfy. It is a hunger that even the best of human devotion, sincere, inherited, beloved, cannot reach. It is not a failure of the tradition. It is the existence of a depth that no tradition by itself can fill. Sundar Lal knew he was sincere. He had been sincere his whole life. And 3 months after his mother's death at 15 years old, with his sincerity fully intact and the hole in his chest still getting wider, he walked out of the house before sunrise, barefoot, and went to the train tracks. He had made his request. He told God, whatever God was, whichever God was listening if any were, that if there was no answer by the time the morning train came through, he was done. He did not say it as a test. He said it as a man at the end of a rope reporting that the rope was ending. He knelt on the gravel between the rails. He bowed his head. He waited. The pressing question for you in this moment is simple. Have you ever been so empty of solutions that you stopped performing your faith and just stated the facts of your situation to whoever might be listening? That raw, unscripted honesty. Not theology, not ritual, just a person and a darkness and a single unadorned question. May be the most dangerous prayer a human being can pray. Because in Sundar Lal's experience, God answered it. He would later describe what happened next in words that he returned to again and again for the rest of his life, never able to improve on them. A light, he said, not outside, inside the light. A presence that did not speak in any language he recognized and at the same time communicated with a clarity that bypassed language entirely. A face. A peace that did not match his circumstances in any logical way. He stood up. He walked home. He had not solved a single problem. His mother was still dead. His father would still be furious. The world was still the world. But something had entered the equation that had not been there before. He told his father that same morning. He did not ease into it. He stood in the main room of the house and said, in plain Punjabi, that he had met Jesus Christ on the train tracks and that he believed now. His father's response was not rage. It was grief, which was harder to bear. The house did not become a war zone overnight. It became something colder than that, a long, sustained season of being present in the same rooms as people who could not understand what had happened to you and could not simply dismiss it because you were not a stupid person, and you were not, as far as they could tell, insane. Sundar Lal's relatives came in shifts, uncles, cousins, family friends who had known him since he was small. Each one tried a different approach. Logic, history, love, reminder of the family's honor, reminder of his mother's faith. That last one was the hardest to answer without weeping. He ate his meals alone. He slept in a room that felt smaller every night, and he prayed. He was baptized 4 months later in a small mission church on the edge of the city, attended by 11 people, none of them related to him. His father, when he heard, sent a letter. One sentence. Sundar Lal kept it for years but never quoted it publicly. He said only that it was written in love and that love made it harder to read than hatred would have. Now here is what you need to understand about what happened after the baptism. There was no Azusa Street. There was no great revival, no room full of light, no witnesses testifying to a halo. There was a 19-year-old boy who had been formally disowned by his family, who had no money and no plan, who put on the saffron robe of a sadhu, a holy man, and walked out into the roads of northern India with one conviction and no itinerary. The conviction was this: the people of India would not receive the gospel from a man in a suit. They might receive it from a man who lived among them, the way the ancient seekers of truth had always lived, without possessions, without institution, without the armor of Western civilization, protecting him from the actual cost of what he was saying. He had no backing. No organization believed in him. He was 19 years old and barefoot, and he was walking into the Punjab with a Bible and no sandals. The roads were not kind. He slept in ditches. He ate what was given to him, and frequently nothing was given. He contracted a fever in Patiala that kept him on the floor of a stranger's house for 6 days. He was turned away from villages. He was mocked in market squares. A group of young men in one town followed him for 3 hours, repeating the name of Christ back to him in progressively more obscene variations. He kept walking. What set Sundar Lal apart was not the miraculous, though the miraculous would come. What set him apart was the arithmetic of his life, the way the numbers added up to something that should not have been sustainable and yet somehow was. He had nothing, and he kept going. He was rejected, and he kept going. He was sick, and he kept going. Not out of stubbornness, out of what he described as a hunger that moving satisfied in a way that staying still never did. He said it plainly in a letter he wrote during those first years. When I stop, I begin to feel the absence of him again. When I walk with him. So I keep walking. He was 23 when he first attempted Tibet. You have to understand what Tibet was in 1906 for a Christian sadhu from the Punjab. It was not simply a difficult journey. It was a jurisdiction that had formally banned the Christian message, enforced by a Buddhist theocracy that had the authority to imprison, torture, and execute those who violated the edict. Several missionaries before him had tried. Several had not returned. And Sundar Lal was not unaware of this. He was not reckless. He was simply operating from a calculation that was different from most people's. If the people beyond the Himalayan passes had never heard what he now knew, and if the cost of telling them was his life, then the arithmetic still favored going. He crossed the Shipki Pass in June. The cold at that altitude is not a metaphor. It is a physical presence that pushes against you with intention. Men have died on that path not because they were unprepared, but because the mountain has its own terms. Sundar Lal did not have good boots. He had borrowed sandals and the robe he had worn for 4 years, and the knowledge that he had been in worse places. Not physically, but in the sense that mattered more. He preached in the first village he reached. He was arrested on the 3rd day. In the tradition of Tibetan theocratic justice at the time, the trial was not a trial in any Western sense. There was no weighing of evidence. There was a determination of fact, that this man had spoken of Christ in a land where Christ was forbidden, and then a determination of consequence. The consequence was a dry well on the edge of the village, 20 feet deep, into which the bodies of the condemned were thrown along with the refuse of the town. He was lowered in on the 3rd day after his arrest. He would later describe this experience with a quietness that disturbed people more than dramatics would have. He said the smell was the first thing, then the dark, then the silence, which was not silence, because things were living in the refuse around him, and they were not small. He could not stand, he could barely crouch. The walls were stone, and the lid above him was locked. He prayed, not for rescue. He said he had made his peace with the possibility that this was where the walk ended. He prayed for the people in the village above him. He prayed for the official who had ordered him thrown in. He prayed for the man who had locked the lid. On the 3rd night, the lid opened. He did not see who opened it. A rope descended, he climbed. When he reached the top, there was no one there. The lock, which he had heard click shut above him with his own ears, was lying on the ground open. He walked out of the village before sunrise. He never learned what had happened. He had theories. He stated them carefully and without insistence. He crossed back into India and said nothing about this for several months. The reason he stayed quiet matters. It was not modesty. It was discernment. He had seen in the small communities of young Christians forming around him in the years since his conversion that miracle stories did 2 things in equal and opposite directions. In some people, they deepened faith. In others, they replaced it, gave them something to be excited about, so they wouldn't have to do the harder work of loving the actual people in front of them. He was not interested in producing excitement. He was interested in producing the kind of life that Agnes would have recognized, daily, invisible, costly, and enough. He returned to Tibet 6 more times. The 2nd time, he was beaten on the road and left with 3 broken ribs that healed imperfectly and caused him pain for the rest of his life. The 3rd time, he found a small community of Tibetan believers who had been meeting secretly for 11 years with no outside contact whatsoever. People who had found faith through a single passage of scripture a trader had left behind and had built an entire devotional community around it. He wept when he found them. He said later that in that moment he understood something about God's ability to work without human carriers that permanently rearranged his theology of mission. He wrote about it in a letter. We go thinking we bring the fire. Sometimes we arrive to find it already burning. Our job then is not to light it. Our job is to add to it and get out of the way. By the time Sundar Lal was 35, his name was known in mission circles in London, Edinburgh, New York, and Sydney. Not because he had sought recognition, but because letters about him kept arriving from people who had encountered him, been changed by him, and then needed to tell someone. He was invited to England in 1920 and spent several months speaking to crowds that sometimes numbered in the thousands, wearing his saffron robe, barefoot or in simple sandals, saying things that Cambridge-educated theologians found either profound or unsettling, depending on their tolerance for the idea that God might not be primarily interested in their systems. He said once, in a hall in London, to an audience that had expected something more exotic, "You have the Word of God in more translations than I can count. You have seminaries. You have publishing houses. You have denominations that have argued every sentence of the creed for 500 years. What you lack, many of you, is a simple willingness to be with Him. Alone, without an agenda, just you and the God who made you, in a room with no audience." The room went quiet in a way that rooms do not usually go quiet. He returned to India. He refused the invitations to stay. He refused the offers of support, of institutional affiliation, of a salary, of a title. A bishop in England wrote to him personally offering a formal position within the Anglican missionary structure. Sundar Lal wrote back a single gracious paragraph. He thanked the bishop. He declined. He said he was a sadhu, and sadhus did not have positions. He went back to the road. Here is where honesty requires us to slow down, because not everything in Sundar Lal's life was light. Not everything was survival and rescue and rooms going quiet. There was a season. He was in his early 40s. The road had taken its physical toll. The ribs that had never healed properly made every cold night a renegotiation with pain, when something inside him began to close. Not his faith. His faith was not the thing that was closing. What was closing was his connection to the ordinary world. He had been on the road for 23 years. He did not know how to sit still in a room with other people and talk about everyday things. He did not know how to receive care without deflecting it immediately back into an explanation of someone else's need. Friends who loved him, and there were some, scattered across 3 countries, began to notice that the man who could preach the nearness of God to a crowd of 500 had quietly stopped believing that the nearness of God could reach him personally. In the specific way it reaches a person who lets someone else cook their dinner and ask how they are doing. He would not have named it as spiritual darkness. He would have named it as tiredness, but the people who knew him named it correctly. A woman named Esther, the wife of a pastor in Ludhiana, who had known Sundar Lal for 15 years, said to him one afternoon without preamble, "You have been giving away what God gives you before you have finished receiving it. You are passing the bread before you have taken a piece for yourself." He sat with that for 3 days. He wrote later that those 3 days were among the most difficult of his life. More difficult than the dry well, more difficult than the broken ribs, more difficult than the morning his father's letter arrived. Because in those 3 days, he had to admit that a man can preach the love of God accurately and still have built, without noticing, a private arrangement in which that love is for everyone else. He stopped traveling for 4 months. He stayed in Ludhiana. He let Esther's household feed him and ask him how he was doing, and he tried, haltingly, to answer honestly. Some days he could only sit in the small garden behind the house and do nothing, and let that be enough. He came back. Not to the crowds, not immediately. First to the small things, a village meeting, a letter, a conversation with a young man who was asking the same question Sundar Lal had asked at 15. He found that the 4 months of receiving had changed the quality of what he was now able to give. There was less performance in it, less structure, more of the thing itself. Esther's husband said to him when he left, "You preach better now. I don't know why. You say fewer words and they land differently." Sundar Lal said he knew why. He attempted his final journey into Tibet in 1929. He was 43 years old. The cold had become a permanent resident of his lungs. The ribs were a daily conversation. He had been advised by 2 doctors in different countries not to cross the pass again. He went in April, when the passes were beginning to clear, dressed as he had always been dressed, carrying what he had always carried. He did not return. Search parties were sent. Letters were written. Inquiries were made to every village along the routes he had taken before. Nothing was found. No body, no report, no witness who had seen him fall or fail. He had simply walked into the mountain and the mountain had kept him. The response from the communities that had known him, in India, in England, in America, in Australia, was not primarily grief, though grief was there. It was something closer to what you feel at the end of a story that ended the only way it could have. He had said more than once, that he hoped to die on the road rather than in a bed, and that the Himalayas seemed to him the most honest of all possible destinations. He had been walking toward them for 26 years. It was not entirely surprising that he arrived. He left behind no institution. No denomination carries his name. The communities of faith he passed through were changed by his passing, and then continued on their own, which is what he would have wanted. He wrote one small book, translated into 11 languages during his lifetime, which is still in print in several of them. The title, in English, is simply What He Said to Me. Not what I achieved, not what I built. What he said to me. He was a man who walked into the places that organizations would not go, carrying nothing institutional, armed only with the conviction that the God who had met him on the train tracks in Lahore at 3 a.m. could meet anyone, anywhere, under any conditions, including the ones that looked from the outside like the end of all reasonable hope. The question this story asks is not whether you admire Sundar Lal Chopra. The question is whether you believe what he believed, that the darkness you are standing in right now, whatever it is precisely the kind of darkness that has never been able to hold that kind of light. Comment below with, I am hungry for more, if this story has reached something in you that you don't have a word for yet. Do not forget what Esther said to him. You are passing the bread before you have taken a piece for yourself. There are some of you watching this who have been doing the same thing for years. Take a piece. Let yourself be fed. And in our next video, we follow the fire to a different kind of impossible. A woman in early 20th century China who could not read, could not write, had never set foot inside a church, and became the catalyst for one of the largest indigenous Christian movements in Asian history. Her name was Dorcas Chang. The question her story asks is one we have been afraid to ask for a long time. What if God's most important instruments are the ones the institution never noticed? Because the institution was looking in the wrong direction entirely.